Associate Professor of Political Science at Vanderbilt University. And let me welcome you to the show, Professor Waller.
Okay.
Professor Waller, much has happened in China over the last couple of days. And when we originally planned this show, essentially what we wanted to talk about was the student movement in China. And we would like for you to start us off by giving us some information in reference to China itself. Many of our viewers know about China, but perhaps there are some things that you feel that are important that they must understand in order that we might understand the Chinese student movement today. So let's start off by looking at it from that perspective.
Well, what we're witnessing now is something which is really unprecedented. You have the largest country in East Asia, the world's most populous country, the world's the country with the world's largest communist party, faced with a tragic situation, but one which is, of course, absolutely at the same time fascinating to any student of international affairs. I say it's unprecedented because I don't think that we've ever had a situation in the communist world before of this kind. We've had situations in Eastern Europe where Soviet forces have suppressed movements, not necessarily student movements, but movements for greater freedom and democracy, for breaking away from the Soviet bloc. But a movement of this magnitude within the communist world, and of this, the nature of this tragedy is really unprecedented.
Well, now, looking at it from that perspective, do you find any comparisons between what we might be familiar with and what is going on in China now? For example, when we talk about the student movement, I think most of us are familiar with the 1960s, thinking in terms of the student movement in this country. Would you or could you make any kind of comparison that our viewers might understand in terms of dealing with this whole situation?
In the sense of there being a demand for greater participation on the part of the protesters, I suppose that you can draw some comparisons, but since one took place within the framework of a relatively open, free, democratic system like the United States, and the others taking place within the framework of an authoritarian communist system, and the magnitude of the violence and the massacre is such that it doesn't make comparisons really very viable, I think.
Well, now, if you look at what went on over the weekend in China, in terms of what is now being called the massacre, if you look at what went on within that direction, do you find anything in the history of the Communist Party in China that might equal some of the things that are now developing?
Well, one can go back even before 1949 when the communists came to power in China and look at the so-called May 4th movement of 1919, which was a student-led protest against the settlement on the part of the great powers at the end of the First World War, and which led to the Chinese delegation walking out of the agreement and refusing to sign the treaty. So there's a precedent which went back some years, and which, of course, the students in May 4th, 1989 were able to celebrate in Tiananmen Square. If you take just the communist period since 1949, the closest approximation is really the upheavals of the Cultural Revolution and the activities of the Red Guards. But again, it's not really a comparable situation because the Red Guards were brought into play by the communist leader, by Chairman Mao Zedong himself. And here, of course, it's a movement against the party, not encouraged by authority.
Now, I think we all understand that it's a movement against the government, and I think it has now been described as a pro-democratic movement. We've talked about the goddess of democracy and all of those things. But now, if you see it as a pro-democratic movement, I think the implication is that there is something that is wrong with the Chinese government. People have talked about some of the shortcomings of this government. Perhaps you would like to give us some information in reference to the shortcomings of the government, recognizing that communism is throughout not only China, but Russia is fighting for its own survival today. But what are some of the shortcomings you find in the Chinese government?
I think it might be worthwhile noting at first that when the Chinese students call for freedom and democracy, they're not necessarily calling for democracy as we know it in the United States or Great Britain. I'm sure that some of them are, particularly those perhaps who have had their education in the West. But many others, I think, are wanting to improve the nature of the communist system. They want to have more openness, more democracy, but within the framework of a communist system. And here you come into play with the problems of the government, such as corruption, for example, and inflation. Corruption, the ability of people who are well connected to do quite well for themselves financially, while the vast mass of the people are relatively poor. And inflation has hit the urban people much more severely than the rural peasantry. It's officially estimated that inflation is running at 19% per annum. Unofficially, people put it at about double that. Well, that's, you know, it's a tremendous burden upon any family to try and budget or to make ends meet with inflation of that kind when salaries simply aren't keeping up with it.
And so there's a greater demand for freedom. Freedom of the press, for example, I think is also a part of that. Now, how would you characterize these freedoms within the framework of the Communist Party? I mean, it seems to me that the Communist Party is an attempt to try to control the thoughts of the population. But now, how can there be freedom of the press, freedom of speech, all of those things that we generally associate with Western democracy within the context of the Communist Party? I mean, how would that be possible?
No, the simple answer is, of course, that it's, in our terms, it isn't, because in our terms it requires a multi-party system with free and competing political parties. That's not what the Communist Party has in mind. The Communist Party has in mind a limited degree of democracy, a limited amount of freedom of the press, so that if we were resident in China, you or I could make suggestions as to how things might be run better, perhaps even criticize the party. But when you come to the point of saying, well, why should there just be a single party? Why should the Communist Party be the only party which has a right to rule? Why don't we have other opposition parties? Why doesn't the governing party switch perhaps from the Communist Party to a non-Communist party? That kind of thing, I think, would be absolutely strictly off limits. And indeed, even the pro-student, the more reformist members of the leadership, such as the apparently now deposed General Secretary Zhao Ziyang, has not been in favor of a multi-party movement. So it's a very limited kind of democracy. But of course, once you give people a degree of freedom and a degree of democracy, it's very difficult to call a halt and say, so far but no further. They have a tendency to want to continue.
Very good. And let me thank you for that part of the information and dealing with this segment. And we'll be back with you following this commercial break.